the 11th century, where Bloodwolf lineages rule supreme, and sacred threads bind fates that no eye can see. She was never meant to be remembered. For 3 years, Runa lived in the shadow of a court that had already decided what she was: a weaver, a placeholder, a name that would quietly disappear. Every morning, a cup of medicine arrived from her stepmother's hands. Every morning, she drank it. She didn't know it was slowly blinding her, dimming the rare gift she'd inherited from her mother: the ability to see the invisible threads that bind people together. What she also didn't know: the most powerful man in the kingdom was dying, and the only thread still keeping him alive ran directly through her. The conspiracy had been running for 8 years. A stepmother who played the long game, a mage who sold his loyalty, a father who chose silence over his daughter. But they miscalculated one thing. The night a king slipped away from his own coronation feast, wandered into a storm-dark library, and sat down across from a girl who looked at his crest and called him arrogant to his face. On the day she was supposed to disappear forever, he walked out of the shadows and said, "Stop," and shattered everything Mervain had built. So the real question is, what did he see in her that 3 years of a curse still couldn't make him forget? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. The storm arrived before midnight. Thunder rolled across the Alps in long, slow waves, and the library windows rattled in their stone frames like something outside wanted in. Most of the palace had retreated to warm chambers and mulled wine hours ago. The corridors were empty. The great hall was dark. Runa was still working. The candle nearest her left hand had burned to a stub, and she had not noticed until the wax ran over the edge of the brass holder and onto the work table in a thin white river. She blotted it without looking up. The tapestry spread across the frame before her was nearly finished. The coronation piece, due at dawn, the most important work she had produced in her 3 years of service as the palace's sacred tapestry weaver. The silver wolf on its field of midnight blue stared back at her with unfinished eyes. She always gave them eyes last. Some things needed to be earned. The door at the far end of the library opened. Runa did not look up. Servants came and went. Guards made their rounds. She had learned early that the most useful thing a tapestry weaver could do was disappear into her work, to become as unremarkable as the stones in the wall, as constant and as unnoticed. But the footsteps that crossed the library floor were not a servant's footsteps. They were unhurried, deliberate. The footsteps of someone accustomed to owning every room they entered, even when they were doing their best not to be noticed. She kept her needle moving. The wolf's left eye is slightly higher than the right. The voice came from just behind her left shoulder, low, unhurried. Not unkind. Her needle paused for exactly 1 heartbeat before she resumed. "Whoever this is, they have spent time looking at wolves." "I know," she said, without turning. "He earned the asymmetry. The right eye watches what is in front of him. The left watches what might come from the side." She pulled the thread through. Kings should have both. Silence. Then, and she almost missed it, a sound she had not expected. He laughed. It was brief and real and slightly rough, as though it had surprised him as much as it surprised her. She heard it settle into the air and then disappear, absorbed by the stone walls and the rain. Interesting. She looked up. He was not dressed as a king. The wool cloak was plain, good quality, undyed, and slightly damp at the shoulders where the rain had found its way through. Dark hair pushed back from a face that stopped her internal monologue entirely. The jaw was hard set, the kind that looked like it had been arranged for function rather than beauty. A small scar at the left corner of his mouth, pale against his skin. Eyes that caught the candlelight and held it without warmth. He is right there. The wolf inside her stirred, not violently, but deeply, the way something ancient and sleeping shifts when it recognizes a scent it has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. She did not let it move her face. "You haven't asked who I am," he said. "You haven't asked who I am either." She looked back at the tapestry. "I assumed we were both enjoying the novelty." He moved to the chair on the other side of the work table and sat without being invited. She kept stitching. The storm pressed against the windows. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the part she hadn't prepared for. "Why isn't this uncomfortable?" "The design," he said eventually, nodding toward the silver wolf. "You made him look like he's thinking. He should be. He's about to be a king." A pause. "Do you know who he is? The man the wolf represents?" "I've never met him." She smoothed the section of thread with her thumb, checking the tension. "But I know he's arrogant. Look at how the crest was designed. Every proportion is slightly too grand. The shield runs a full inch wider than tradition allows. Whoever approved this pattern wanted to be seen from very far away." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not offended, not amused exactly. Something between the two that had no name in any language she knew. "Is that so?" he said. "The embroidery doesn't lie." She met his gaze. "The man who ordered this crest is either very sure of himself or very afraid of not being seen as sure of himself. Those are different things." He considered this for a long moment. The fire in the corner sconce threw moving shadows across the table between them. "What would you change about it?" She considered. The wolf's posture. He's standing too straight. A wolf that still has something to prove stands like this. She gestured at the tapestry. A wolf that knows what he is stands a little lower, more settled, like the ground itself belongs to him. He looked at the tapestry for a long time after that. She could feel the weight of his attention without seeing it, the way you feel a change in pressure before weather turns. By the time she recognized him, a chance angle of candlelight across that jaw, the specific stillness of the man who had filled every room she'd ever heard described, she had already said all of it. The needle dropped from her fingers. She was reaching to kneel when his hand came down on the work table, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the displacement of air. "Don't." His voice was level. "Tonight, I am not the king. I am a man who needed somewhere quiet." Her wolf pressed forward, more urgently this time. Him. It has always been going to be him. She put that thought somewhere small and dark and locked, picked up her needle, and resumed stitching. They sat together for 2 more hours while the storm worked its way across the mountains. He watched her work. She let him. Before he left, he paused at the door with his back to her, one hand on the frame. "You sew as if you can see things other people can't." "That's why I do this work," she said. The door closed, the candles burned lower. Runa sat alone in the storm-quiet library and looked at the silver wolf's unfinished eyes. Her wolf pressed its muzzle against her ribs from the inside and said nothing. It didn't need to. The tapestry was delivered at dawn. Runa returned to her chamber with ink-stained fingers and needles still tucked in her sleeve, expecting nothing but sleep. Her father was standing in the middle of the room. Lord Aldrich Ashvale was not a large man, and he seemed smaller than usual in the gray morning light, his shoulders carrying the particular collapse of a man who has already decided something and is no longer willing to look at the cost. Beside him, Lady Mervane stood with her hands folded at her waist and a smile arranged across her face, like a painting hung slightly crooked on a wall. "You've been chosen," her father said, "as betrothed to the Alpha King." The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Runa's first thought was very small and very calm. She did this. Mervane's smile didn't widen. It didn't need to. She had selected Runa because she believed Runa was manageable, quiet, contained, unlikely to make demands. A useful first piece, easily moved when the time came to install Isolde in her rightful place. What Mervane had not accounted for was the man in the library, his rough, surprised laugh, The silver wolf, with its earned asymmetry. She had not known these things existed. She was already losing a game she didn't know she was playing. Runa said, "I understand," in the same voice she used to confirm thread orders. She looked not at Mervain's smile, but at her father's hands, the way they hung slightly open at his sides, as if he had already let go of something and was waiting to discover what he'd held. That night, in her chamber above the weaving rooms, she felt the change. Not in herself, in the air. A tightening, like fabric pulled taut from both ends. The sensation of a thread under too much tension, just before it gives. She pressed her palm to her sternum and felt her wolf go very still. Something had been cut. Not broken by accident. Cut. Deliberately. She did not yet know the name for what had been done, or that Mervain had moved the very same night she realized the bond was real. Had sent word to a pale-haired mage in the forest and paid him to ensure what was growing would never grow. She only knew the cold had entered the air, and that it felt like a door being closed from the outside. 3 years is a long time to stand on one side of a window. Runa learned the architecture of distance. She learned which hours Caleb moved through the eastern corridor, which meals he attended without eating, which petitioners he heard with genuine attention. She kept her eyes on her work when he was near, because looking at him directly had started to feel like touching something that belonged to someone else. He was courteous, precisely, carefully courteous. The kind of courtesy that functions as a wall you cannot point at and say, "This is a wall." The cold medicine arrived every morning in a small cup, Mervain delivering it herself. "For your constitution, dear, you've always run thin." Runa drank it because she had learned to choose her battles, because Sir Edrin's safety depended on her compliance, because the confrontation she wanted required weapons she didn't yet have. She didn't know it was suppressing her thread scene. She only knew that the threads she could usually see, those shimmering filaments that ran between people and recorded the invisible architecture of loyalty and love and grief, had gone slightly dim, like looking through gauze. She told herself it was the palace air. She told herself it was grief for her mother, still unspent. She told herself many things, and some of them were even true. What she couldn't explain was the man who had laughed in a storm-dark library, who now looked through her at dinners, who spoke past her in council rooms, whose gaze never quite landed on her face, as if something between them had been made deliberately blurry. "Something is wrong with him," her wolf said. "I know," she answered. "Something is being done to him." She held that knowledge like a coal in closed hands, not acting on it, not releasing it, keeping it warm until she understood enough to move. The gray dress arrived before she was fully awake. Mervain set it across the foot of the bed herself, which meant this was not a servant's errand. It was a message delivered with smiling teeth. Behind her, 2 household guards stood in the corridor, with Sir Edrin between them. His wrists bound at the front with common rope, his jaw set with the dignity of a man who has decided that what is being done to him will not alter his posture. He met Runa's eyes over Mervain's shoulder. She looked at the gray dress. Every woman at today's ceremony would wear house colors. Runa, in gray, would be a shadow among banners, something that had already been decided and needed only to stand in the correct position and be witnessed becoming nothing. She wants me to feel it before I even arrive. She felt something else entirely. Her hands were steady as she reached for the dress. In the pocket, her fingers found a small square of linen, something tucked there after the dress had been made, after Mervain had been distracted elsewhere, and Sister Rin had slipped through the servant's entrance. A wild violet, worked in Rin's unmistakable small stitches. No words, just the flower, and the message that was the flower. Courage. "How kind," Runa said, in a voice she had been practicing for 3 years. "I'll be ready within the hour." Mervain's smile didn't shift. "Of course you will." The guards led Edrin away. He went without looking back. That restraint, the deliberate refusal to give Mervain the satisfaction of a farewell, told Runa everything she needed to know about the morning ahead. Don't react. Calculate. The coronation hall smelled of pine resin and torch smoke, and the particular dry cold of stone that had been heated for only a few hours. Runa was brought in through the servants' entrance and positioned behind the second pillar from the east, a place from which she could witness the ceremony and be seen by no one, or nearly no one. The music began. Isolde came through the main doors in ivory silk, her chestnut hair loose across her shoulders, a sheaf of white hawthorn in her gloved hands. Lord Aldrich walked beside her with the measured stride of a man performing a role he had rehearsed enough times to stop feeling it. He did not look toward the second pillar from the east. Not inattention, deliberate avoidance. She could read it in the specific angle of his jaw, the direction his gaze chose and held. He knew exactly where she was standing. He was choosing not to look. That, her wolf said, is worse. From the crowd, voices wound through the processional music, like a second melody no one had composed. Where is the Ashvale girl? Gone. I heard she withdrew of her own accord. Sensible. For the kingdom's sake. Runa pressed the folded linen square against her palm inside her sleeve, breathed through her nose, and was very, very still. He appeared at her elbow, between the processional and the vows, unbound now, the rope gone, hands free. She didn't ask how. Some things were better not catalogued. He pressed a folded paper into her hand. His knuckle grazed hers, deliberate, a signal. You are not alone. Thaddeus needs to see you, immediately after the ceremony. Something you must know about the king. Idrin's lips barely moved. Do not leave the palace today. Whatever happens. Whatever she tells you after. Hear me? I hear you. Good. He was already stepping back, becoming invisible among the crowd. He paused once. Little Flame. She had not heard that name in 3 years. It moved through her chest like a struck bell, still ringing long after the sound itself had gone. The drums began. The high priest asked the question in formal Latin. Whether the previous betrothed would voluntarily release her claim so that the ceremony might proceed in accordance with the house agreement sealed 3 years prior. Runa said, I consent. Her voice did not shake. That was the one thing she had been absolutely certain of. It would not shake. She had spent 3 years building the architecture of that certainty, stone by stone. She began to lower herself. The thread snapped. It came from the wall behind the altar, the tapestry she had woven 2 years ago as a gift to the ceremony hall, her finest work, with 100 hours of silver embroidery along the border. A single clear note, high and brief, like a thin wire finally conceding. Sacred thread did not snap, not without cause. Not unless something nearby was generating enough curse force to overwhelm a warded weave. She was on one knee, head bowed, when her wolf rose to its full height inside her and howled. Not fear, not warning. Something older, something with no word in the human part of her vocabulary. He is close. He is here. And something is killing him. She kept her head down. She kept her face still. But her hands, hidden in the folds of the gray skirt, were no longer steady. The word fell into the ceremony like a blade dropped into still water. One word, one syllable. The kind of voice trained from birth to carry across battlefields and council chambers, which now filled the coronation hall from stone floor to vaulted ceiling, without effort, without theater. A voice that did not need to rise to be obeyed. Runa did not look up. Not yet. She kept her eyes on the rush-strewn floor and the hem of Isolde's ivory gown, and the particular way torchlight made everything the color of old gold. And she waited. He did not come from the direction of the altar. The movement came from her left, from behind the heavy curtain beside the second pillar, from the place where someone had been standing for the entire ceremony. close enough that she might have heard him breathe if the drums hadn't been so loud. Close enough to have watched her kneel. His scent reached her before anything else. Cold iron and winter air, and beneath both, something warmer that her wolf recognized before her mind had caught up. He's been here, this whole time. He chose to stand here. Isolde stepped toward him. "Calum, you do not call me by that name." The temperature in his voice was somewhere below the frost line, and he hadn't raised it a fraction. Silence collapsed across the hall. He walked down the dais steps as though each one was a statement of intent. Runa watched the floor and counted footsteps. 7 from the dais, 4 more across the stone, then they stopped. His shadow fell across her hands. She became very conscious of her own breathing, the specific effort of making it even, the way it required thought when it usually did not. "Look up." Not an order. That was what caught her off guard. It was the voice of a man who had been holding a sentence inside for too long and had finally stopped. The particular sound of something released. She raised her head. His eyes were the gray she remembered from the library, but something had changed in them. The controlled distance she had grown accustomed to over 3 years, that carefully maintained glass wall, was simply gone. He was looking at her the way her wolf had been looking at him. Like something found after being lost so long the finder had stopped using the word lost and learned to use the word gone. From the altar, Isolde stepping down, reaching for his arm. "You're not well." "Let me." He withdrew before she made contact. Not rough, absolute. The removal of a man from a possibility, complete and total. "Do not touch me." The hall breathed. Or rather, it stopped breathing, then remembered to start again. "I will bind myself to no one but her." Runa was still kneeling. The gray dress pooled around her on the rush-strewn floor. She looked up at him and said, "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." Pitched low, beneath the hearing of the crowd. "It is the first time in 3 years that I have known exactly what I want." He held out his hand. His fingers were not steady. A faint tremor, not weakness, but something working hard to stay contained. She noticed that before anything else. Then, the callus on the right index finger, placed exactly where a quill rests through hours of work. Small, unremarkable. The mark of a man who read his own dispatches and wrote his own replies, who did not leave the thinking to others. She did not know why that detail moved her, when the grand gesture had not. She placed her hand in his. The warmth that moved through the point of contact was not temperature. It was recognition, deep, cellular, older than either of them. Her wolf pressed itself against the inside of her ribs, and what it felt was not hunger and not longing, but was made of both. She put it away. There was still too much she didn't understand. The smell of beeswax candles and old grievances. Mervain had arranged her evidence on the table, like pieces in a game she had been practicing for 8 years. And the centerpiece was a letter bearing Thaddeus's seal, the royal physician's mark pressed deep into the red wax. "The lady carries cursed blood," she said, in the pleasant voice she reserved for conclusions she had already made inevitable. "The royal physician has confirmed it in writing." Calum picked up the letter. He read it. He set it down with the care of a man about to say something very precise. "Thaddeus signed this." "He did, my lord." "Interesting." He did not look up. Thaddeus sustained a sword injury to his right hand during the autumn campaign. He has not been able to write independently since. This signature was not made by a man with a healing sword wound. It was not made by him at all. The silence that followed had physical weight. Mervain adjusted, the way water adjusts around an obstacle, wearing it down so slowly the stone doesn't notice until it's already smooth. "There may have been a misunderstanding." "There was," Calum said, and stood. "I will find the source of it." 3 steps outside the chamber door. That was as far as he got, before his hand shot out and found the wall. Not the deliberate pause of a man choosing to stop, but the unilateral decision of a body that had run out of something essential. Runa had followed at a distance, and she stood 3 feet behind him now, watching the line of his shoulders and the careful calculation of his breathing. Cold. He's cold. Not the room. Him. She knew that cold. She had pressed her palm to her mother's wrist in the last weeks before the end, and it had felt like this. The cold of something being taken from the inside out. Warmth leaving by increment. She moved to his side. He turned his head fractionally, not looking at her, but registering her the way a wolf always registers what stands nearby. "If I help you," she said, "you don't get to order my silence about this afterward." The torchlight made the shadows in the old mortar deep as cuts. Agreed. She moved to his right, brought his arm across her shoulders, and took his weight. He was heavier than she'd expected, and at every point of contact, her shoulder, her side, the curve of her neck where his forearm rested, he was cold as January stone. Like my mother, before she didn't finish the thought. She started walking. The fire had burned to coals. She rebuilt it with the efficiency of someone who had been tending other people's hearths for 3 years. Tinder first, then the smaller wood, patience before the larger pieces. He watched from the chair. She felt it without turning, a particular quality of attention, the kind that observes rather than assesses. When she finally stood and turned, she saw it. On the corner of the work table, held down by a small river stone, was a piece of cloth no larger than her palm. Undyed linen, a few lines of embroidery along one edge, thread gone slightly loose with time. The first thing she had ever stitched here, abandoned in the library one night when she'd run out of the right color. The night of the storm. "You kept that." It wasn't a question. He looked at the cloth for a moment. "It reminded me of a night I was somewhere quiet and did not have to be the king. And of the person who told me I was arrogant." Something moved in her chest. She didn't look away from the cloth. She made herself breathe at her normal pace. She crossed to him and pressed her palm flat against his sternum. The thread-seeing came back all at once, like eyes adjusting to darkness, sudden and overwhelming after weeks of gauze. The bond was right there, thick, luminous, the kind of thread that should have been unmissable from the first moment of recognition. And wound through it, deep and deliberate, something dark and viscous, that tightened a little more with every passing week. "Someone has cursed your bond," she said. In the firelight, his eyes were darker than silver and more complicated than she had prepared herself for. "I know." The night of the betrothal ceremony. He was looking at the fire. "The moment it ended, I felt something sever, like a rope cut mid-tension, and from that night, the cold has never left." Runa stood by the window. Outside, the Alps were going dark, the last light leaching from the snowline. "When is it worse? When you're near me or away from me?" The fire shifted. He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. "Near you, it retreats." The levelness of his voice was the levelness of a man who has found, through considerable effort, exactly this register and is holding it carefully. "As if you are standing between me and whatever is on the other side." And when I knelt today, like the wall being taken away. She stood at the window a little longer than she needed to, because the darkening peaks were easier to look at than his face right now, and she needed to think clearly. "I'll need to find the person who made this," she said finally. "There's a name I haven't been able to access. My mother left records, but my thread-seeing has been suppressed for 3 years. The medicine Mervain has been giving me." A breath. "I stopped taking it this morning. It will take time to clear, but it's already clearing." "I have less time than I'd prefer," he said. "Then don't waste what you have." She moved toward the door, stopped without turning. "I couldn't see what was being done to you. I couldn't see what was being done to me. That ends now." She left him to the fire, and the kept cloth on the work table. If she had looked back, she would have seen the way he watched the door after it closed. Not the expression of a king, not the expression of a man who has gotten what he wanted. Simply, the expression of a man watching the last source of warmth leave a very cold room, and choosing to believe it will return. She did not look back. Several days after the ceremony, Thaddeus's right hand was steadier than it had been in autumn, not fully healed, but capable. His assistant sat ready to transcribe whatever the physician couldn't write himself. "Suppressant herb," Thaddeus said, holding the small residue vial to the light. "Thornholt variety, extraordinarily rare. Only pact mages know its preparation or its use." "What does it do?" "Suppresses thread seeing, muffles mate bond recognition in both parties." He set the vial down. "Long-term use prevents a bonded pair from fully recognizing each other, from recognizing that they are what they are." The number of years sat in her chest like a stone. "The herb grows in Thornholt Forest," he continued, reading from his notes. "There is currently one known resident of that region." Runa was already at the door. Mira. Her wolf went very still inside her. Not the stillness of fear, but of something bracing for a weight it had not expected to carry. He was drinking alone. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the way he looked when she entered. Not surprised, not defensive. The look of a man who has been keeping an appointment with himself for years and has finally arrived. She stood in the middle of his chamber and looked at the man who had taught her to read, who had lifted her onto his shoulders at the Midwinter Festival when she was 4 years old, who had chosen, when it became necessary to choose, not to see. "Did you know?" "Part of it." The wine was amber in the firelight. He looked at his hands. "I knew she wanted Isolde in your place. I knew about the medicine. I did not know she had your mother killed. You knew and did nothing. I was afraid." He said it the way a man reads a verdict he has written himself. "Your mother was brave. I have never been." The fire popped. Wind crossed the courtyard somewhere outside. "She deserved better," Runa said. "So did I." She left him there, without raising her voice, without slamming the door. She closed it quietly, and the quiet was the harder thing to receive. Behind her, in the silence she left in the room, Lord Aldrich set down his wine and sat for a long time. Then he moved to his writing desk and began to pull letters from the locked drawer. Letters he had kept, without quite knowing why, for 8 years. Mervain's letters. Her handwriting. Her seal. He laid them on the desk and looked at them, and began to sort them by date. It was the only useful thing he knew how to do. Behind the library's east wall, in the narrow gap between the old stonework and the newer addition built in her grandfather's time, there was a door. Sir Edryn showed her how to open it. 3 stones pressed in sequence, a sound like a held breath releasing. He had known about it for 30 years. He had been waiting for the right person to show. Runa stepped inside. The cold that met her was the cold of a room sealed for years. Still, accumulated. The stillness of a place that has been waiting rather than merely empty. Embroidery frames of various sizes leaned against the walls. The thread spools had faded from jewel bright to the color of old wood, but their arrangement, by lineage, by shade, by magic weight, was her mother's system. She recognized it the way she recognized a voice. In the center of the room, on the largest frame, an unfinished tapestry. She moved toward it slowly. The left side showed a child with dark hair bent over an embroidery hoop, tongue pressed to her lower lip in concentration. The detail was extraordinary. This was thread-seeing work, every thread carrying its own weight of meaning, recording not just image, but truth. And beside the child, at the edge of the unfinished section, the outline of a man. Silver-gray eyes, a jaw she recognized. A young man, perhaps 17 or 18 in the tapestry, but unmistakable. Her mother had seen this. Before either of them was who they had become, before the kingdom, before the betrothal, before everything. Her mother had looked through the threads of the world and found this pair and thought, yes, this is where these threads go. The thread spools were hollow. In the largest one, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter with Runa's name on the outside, in handwriting she had not seen in 9 years and would have known in complete darkness. She sat on the cold floor and read it twice. The herb, the curse. The name of the man who had been her mother's student before Mervain's money and her mother's death had turned him into something else. Dorian is not the enemy. He was mine before he was hers. He left a way in, I am certain of it. Find him before the curse finishes what it started. He will ask something of you that will be very difficult to give. Give it anyway. Below, in the margin, in slightly different ink, added later, perhaps near the end. The reversal formula is in the border of the unfinished tapestry. Written in thread sign. Only thread-seeing can read it. Take the whole frame. And Runa, the cloth Sister Wren has been keeping, belongs to you. She knows when to give it. Her wolf pressed its forehead against her sternum from the inside, a gesture with no sound attached. She stood. She lifted the frame. She brought the frame to his chambers, because the light was best there, and because he had already said he didn't sleep, and because she was tired of being in separate rooms with separate pieces of the same problem. He was at the table when she arrived, documents spread before him, candle burning low, his posture the specific posture of a man working through pain he has no intention of mentioning. He looked up, noted the frame, noted her expression, and moved everything to make room. No questions, no objections. She set the frame at the best angle and began to read the border threads. Thread sign was the oldest form of the weaving language. Not pictures but relationships. Not symbols but connections. Each stitch recording not what a thing was, but how it connected to everything around it. Reading it was like learning to see in a frequency you hadn't known your eyes could process. It required time. It required silence. It required the specific quality of attention her mother had spent years cultivating in her, and that Mervain suppressant had been quietly eroding. Without the herb in her blood, her sight was returning, the way feeling returns to a numbed limb. Gradual, painful, irreducibly hers. Calum didn't speak. He refilled the candles when they burned low. When she pressed her knuckles against her temples and held them there, a cup of water appeared at her elbow without comment. She didn't acknowledge it. She drank it. The smell of him, across the table, parchment and cold iron, and the winter-clean scent she had learned to associate with proximity to him. And beneath it, barely, the amber note her wolf kept trying to get her attention about. She filed it in the same locked place as everything else, and kept reading. At some point past the middle of the night, without either of them deciding it, the gap between their chairs had closed. She didn't notice until her shoulder was almost touching his. She didn't move away. He didn't either. By the time the first gray light found the window, she had the full formula. The chapel had no roof. It had possessed one at some point in the previous 3 centuries, but the stones had fallen or been taken for other buildings, and now the November sky came straight in, pale and beginning to lighten in the east, the color of old pewter. The walls stood intact, carved with the oldest Valdrath inscriptions, the ones that predated the current dynasty by enough generations that their meaning was half lost. The floor was packed earth and frost. 3 witnesses, Edrin, Thaddeus, Sister Wren, and at the arched doorway, which had no door and hadn't had one in living memory, Lord Aldrich. Not invited. Present anyway, standing outside the threshold in the early cold, with his hands at his sides and the stack of letters he'd brought tucked under his arm. Runa saw him from the altar. He met her eyes. He nodded, small, precise, the gesture of a man presenting a document he cannot unsign, but has chosen to submit anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. She nodded back. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a longer road, and she was not certain where it ended, or whether she would choose to walk the whole distance. But it was acknowledgement. I see you standing there. I see what it cost you to come. Sister Wren pressed a folded cloth into Runa's hands. It was the backing fabric from the tapestry frame, the finished side, the side her mother had completed in the last night of her life, and pressed into Wren's keeping, with instructions Wren had carried for 9 years without being asked to explain them. She told me, when Runa finds the frame, she'll know what to do with what's inside, and she'll need the outside for something else. Wren's voice was steady. She said you'd understand. Runa shook out the cloth. It fell like water, the soft weight of years of patient work. Embroidered on its inner surface, the child at the hoop, and beside her, the silver-eyed figure, the composition finally complete. Her mother had seen this moment and had made it, stitch by stitch, and had folded it away for a daughter who would need it on a cold morning in a roofless chapel, wearing no color but her own. Runa draped it over her shoulders like a mantle. There you are, Mama. Here I am. The officiating sister asked for the vows. Calum gave the formal ones in measured Latin, his voice even, and then, before she could continue to the next portion of the rite, I vow to see you, every day, whether I am well or not. The chapel walls held the sound for a moment after he stopped speaking. Runa, I vow to pull you back when you are pulled away. The mark came like a key in a lock that had been installed 3 years before its key was made. One sharp intake of breath, and then the bond opened, fully and without reservation, with the force of something that has been held back for a very long time and no longer has reason to be. 3 years of him. Every night he had found himself standing in the corridor outside the library, without knowing why the corridor drew him. Every dinner, where his gaze had moved toward her chair and then away, and the moving away had taken more effort than it should have. The night he had gone back to the library after the palace was sleeping, just to sit near the work table in the dark, just to be in a room that smelled of beeswax and thread and her particular stillness, just to be closer to something he hadn't been allowed to name. You remember that night, she said, not a question. He looked at her. In the pale light coming through the open sky, with the cold and the stone and the witnesses, and the man standing at the door, and her mother's cloth across her shoulders. His eyes, silver gray and present and fully, completely here. Every detail, he said. It was the only night the cold was absent. It happened that same evening, not gradually, all at once, the way suppressed things resurface when the lid is finally removed. The bond, newly complete, was a surface it could work with. The curse moved through it like water finding a crack, pressing into the new connection, trying to use it as a lever. Runa felt it the moment it began, not through her own body, but through his. The bond carrying the information, the way a rope carries tension between 2 points. She was already on her feet when Calum's hand found the bedpost. I know what I need to do, she said. Thornholt. His voice was steady through considerable effort. Thaddeus traced the herb's source. And there's a name, Dorian Vale. He left markers, deliberately placed. He wanted to be found. I know. She had her mother's letter by memory now. He left them for me specifically. She crossed to the door. I'll be back before— Go! He released the bedpost. Go, now. She went. The forest was old in the way northern forests are old. Not picturesque old, but prior old, existing before the categories of beautiful and useful had been invented. The path closed behind her as she entered, and the sounds of the palace fell away, replaced by the deep winter silence of trees that have been standing in the same place for centuries and have no opinion about what passes beneath them. Mira came out of the trees to her left before Runa had gone a quarter mile. Moving silently, a woman who had spent 3 decades learning the specific skill of not being found, with a knife at her belt and wariness in every line of her face. She stopped 10 feet away and regarded her niece the way you regard something you had hoped you would not have to face. "The herb," Runa said. Mira's jaw tightened. "He came to me, a young mage, white hair, exhausted eyes, said your stepmother was worried about your constitution, that the herb from my forest would help you." She breathed out slowly. "He was Serene's student once. I knew his face from years ago, from visits to the palace before everything changed. I thought he was still hers." A pause that cost something. "I didn't know what I was providing. I didn't know what it was for." Runa looked at her aunt. She let her thread-seeing move forward, gently, not invasive, just present. The thread between Mira and her mother was right there, intact, warm and faded the way a well-read letter fades, worn thin by frequent handling, but never broken. The thread between Mira and herself was frayed at one end, from years of no contact, but it was hers to repair if she chose. She chose. "He's here?" she asked. Mira turned and led her through the trees. The fire was small and burning low. Dorian Vale sat beside it with his eyes already open. White-haired, blue-eyed, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for so long, he no longer experiences it as weight, but as self. He looked up when she stepped into the small clearing. "You look like her," he said. "I know. I left the markers because I couldn't dismantle my own architecture. You don't unweave a curse you constructed. It fights you back. But thread-seeing can reach it from the outside." He turned a stick in the fire. "Your mother told me that, before everything changed. She taught me most of what I know." A pause with something broken at the bottom of it. "And then I sold what she taught me to the woman who had her killed." The fire made small sounds. The forest was very still. "I don't want knowledge," Dorian said, before she could speak. "I don't want money, or immunity, or a position in your new court." He looked at the fire. "Mervain paid me well. Then, when I had given her everything she needed, she removed my family, to ensure silence." His hands were flat on his knees. "I have been silent anyway, because there was nowhere to put the sound. I want to die with someone in the world who understands that I was not, that I was afraid, and greedy, and wrong. And also not only that." Runa sat with this. Her wolf was still. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the dark between the trees, frost was settling on bark. Her mother's words. "He will ask something very difficult to give. Give it anyway." "I can't forgive you today," she said. "Not honestly. I don't have it yet." She met his eyes. "But I don't judge you as only that thing. And I will say, to anyone who asks, that you were not the last enemy, that there was a reason and a cost, and that at the end you tried to leave a door open." Dorian was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached inside his coat and produced two things, a leather-wrapped document and a small carved box sealed with wax. The box held the reversal components. The document was 8 years of Mervain's architecture. Names, dates, payments, letters she'd sent him. Letters he'd kept as the only insurance available to a man who had given away every other kind of leverage. He had been sitting in this forest with these two objects for 3 years, waiting. "The box for your thread-seeing," he said. "The document for your court." She took both. Behind her, she heard Mira settle quietly beside the fire. Not a word between them, just the presence of a woman who had known Serene's student before he became someone else, who understood the particular weight of choices made under fear, and who had decided to stay. He was waiting at the forest's edge with a small retinue, which meant he had sources she hadn't accounted for, and patience she hadn't underestimated enough. Lord Bastian Moore. She registered the line of his jaw, the particular ease of a man who had never had to work for a first impression, and redirected her attention to his horse before the thought completed itself. "Lady Runa?" He inclined his head. "Courteous. unhurried, the manner of a man who has decided that being unthreatening is his most effective strategy. I came to offer protection. In the event the king doesn't, the king will recover. If he does, naturally. But if he doesn't, his voice was gentle. That, somehow, was worse than a threat. She looked at him directly. Move out of my road, Lord Moore. Through the bond, thin and labored, warm with the effort of holding on, Calem's awareness touched hers. Not words. A question, half-formed. You? Still here, she sent back, in the language that was not language. Still coming. She rode past Bastion without looking back. She heard it when she was still on the stairs. Not the absence of sound, the wrong sound, the too quiet. The held breath of a room full of people who have run out of things to do and are no longer doing any of them. She came through the door to find Thaddeus standing with his hands at his sides, and that stillness, in a man who was always in motion, always performing some action against whatever the problem was worse than any spoken diagnosis. Idrin was at the window. The bond, which had been thin and warm and labored all through the ride back, was gone. Not diminished, gone. The way a voice goes when the speaker stops mid-sentence, not at a natural end, but at an interruption. She crossed the room. The curse used the completed bond as an entry point, Thaddeus said behind her. Any external intervention will bounce. She was already at the bed. I know. Move. She pressed both palms flat against his chest. Through the thread seam, the bond was visible. The curse threads wound through it like wrought through old timber, pressing inward at the core, tightening. But the bond itself was there. She could feel the specific frequency of it, the texture that was irreducibly, recognizably his. Her mother's voice, from a lesson she had thought was theory. The gift is strongest when the feeling is real, not performed. Not constructed, real, even the inconvenient parts. Runa closed her eyes. She took what she had been keeping carefully folded for 3 years, everything she had labeled, not yet, not relevant, not safe to look at, and she unfolded it. The laugh in the library. Brief and rough, surprised out of him, the sound of something real in a palace of performances. The callus on his right index finger, the evidence of a man who did his own work and didn't announce it. The scrap of linen on the corner of the work table. 3 years he had kept it, unable to explain why, because the curse had spent 3 years trying to make him forget. And something in him that went deeper than the curse had refused. The look on his face when she had placed her hand in his in the great hall. Not triumph. The expression of a man recognizing something he had lost so long ago, he'd stopped calling it lost and learned to call it gone. She pushed all of it into the bond. The curse was built for power. It could process power, absorb it, redirect it. It had no architecture for what she was sending. Love that had been tested by suppression and had persisted anyway. Love that had chosen a callus over a gesture, a kept cloth over a declaration, a specific quality of laugh over anything more legible. The dark threads frayed. She pulled where they frayed. She was crying at some point. She didn't decide to, it simply happened. Her tears falling on his chest and her hands in the fabric between them, and she didn't stop because stopping was not an option. The last thread snapped. Under her palms, his heart began again. He opened his eyes. She was still leaning over him, both hands on his chest, her face close. Closer than they had ever been, face to face, in the same present moment, without a curse between them, without 3 years of glass. His gaze found her immediately, no searching, direct, as if it had known where to look. You're crying. I'm not. You are. A pause, long enough to hear the fire and the wind at the window. Because of me. Don't flatter yourself. The scar at the corner of his mouth shifted, a small, imprecise movement, more honest than a smile. His hand came up slowly and touched her jaw, not holding, barely contact, the backs of his fingers against her cheek. Thank you, he said, for pulling me back. I said I would. You did. The cold was leaving his fingertips. She could feel it going, warmth building gradually, like a fire that is finally caught and is now choosing its own pace. I remember every word of it. She stayed where she was, hands on his chest, his fingers at her jaw, neither of them moving, long enough that it became a different kind of moment than either of them had named it yet. The room held them. The fire held them. Outside, the Alps were doing whatever the Alps did at this hour, indifferent and enormous. In the days of his recovery that followed, she found herself talking, in the quiet hours when the palace was between one activity and the next, about the things she had begun to think about. The people in the kingdom who had been seeing threads their whole lives and had been told they were imagining things. The ones whose bonds had been suppressed or disrupted, by accident or by design. A place where they could be found and trained and given the language for what they already knew. He listened in the particular way he listened to things that mattered, completely, without interruption, with the full weight of his attention. When this is done, he said, tell me what ground you need. It's yours. Aldrich laid his letters on the council table and stepped back. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply placed 8 years of Mervain's correspondence in front of the assembled council and the gathered witnesses, and removed himself from the center of the room, because the letters did not need him to narrate them. They were specific and numerous, and written in her hand and bore her seal. And what they described? The threats, the instructions, the payments, the careful management of a husband who had known too much and been kept too afraid to act, made themselves clear without assistance. Dorian's box came second. The payments verified from the other side, the dates, the names, the mage's account of what he had been contracted to do, and what he had been threatened with when he knew too much. 2 independent records pointing to the same woman, who sat at the table's left side, with her amber eyes level and her hands folded at her waist. She did not break. Runa had expected, somewhere beneath everything, that seeing it laid out would cause something to give way in Mervain's face. It didn't. She sat in the wreckage of 8 years of careful work and remained precisely herself. And that specific refusal to concede, was its own kind of verdict. Isolde stepped forward without being called. She had been sitting in the corner for most of the proceedings, and across the days since the ceremony, her posture had been changing. Not the collapse of guilt, but the more complicated process of someone reassembling a picture from pieces that had been handed to her prearranged, now looking at the actual arrangement for the first time. She had not been told. She had been shaped, carefully and consistently, into a position where not knowing served someone else's interests. The distinction mattered. It also, she had begun to understand, did not exonerate her entirely. I want to give testimony, she said. You are not compelled to, Calum said. I know. She stood in the center of the council chamber and spoke clearly, her mother's words, I will clear the path for you, which she had always heard as the confidence of an ambitious woman, which she now understood had been a statement of intent about specific actions she had not been invited to know about. She had not known. She had benefited from not knowing. She understood that these were not the same thing, and were also not entirely different things. I'm not innocent, she said. I knew enough to be convenient. She looked at Runa, directly, without Mervain between them, for what felt like the first time in their shared history. I'm not claiming otherwise. Runa looked at her half-sister's face, the face that had been placed above her own in every calculation for 8 years, and found, to her own surprise, that what she felt most strongly was simply tired. Tired and done, and ready to be done. I know, she said. Isolde's exile was by her own choice, which made it something other than punishment. He entered with the self-possession of a man who has assessed his position accurately and decided honesty is the most effective strategy available. I had intelligence on Lady Mervain's intentions beginning approximately 6 months ago, he said. Sources in 3 separate noble houses. No evidence that would hold in a formal proceeding, only the intelligence itself. Why not bring it to me? Caleb asked. Bastian met his eyes. Because I didn't know who in your council was hers. I was not wrong to be cautious. He paused. Looking at this table, I'm still not entirely certain I was wrong. The council chamber was quiet for a moment. Caleb regarded him for long enough that most men would have looked away. Bastian didn't. You approached my wife on the road to Thornholt. I did. No apology, no elaboration. Runa felt, rather than heard, the specific quality of Caleb's silence beside her. The kind that came with a slight setting of the jaw and a very deliberate stillness of the hands. Bastian was not punished. He left with the standing of a man who had told the truth at the right moment, which was worth something. Later, walking the eastern corridor, he stopped you on the road. You felt that through the bond. I'm asking, Caleb said, in the tone of a man who has confirmed nothing. She glanced at him, the jaw, the deliberate calm, the slight tension at the corner of the mouth where the scar was. You absolutely felt it. I am asking, he repeated. She looked forward. The smile came before she could file it away, and this time she decided not to. It was the first one since the ceremony that arrived without a calculation attached, and it was hers, and she kept it. The verdict was delivered in the Great Hall. Runa stood at Caleb's right in her house colors. No gray, no shadow, no second pillar. The bond ran warm and full between them, visible to her thread-seeing as a cord of clean light, no longer the struggling, suppressed thing it had been, but something that had found its full weight and held it without effort. After the sentence, Caleb stood. I want the court to understand something. His voice carried without effort, as it always had. The woman beside me is not here because I chose her in a dramatic moment. She is not here because of political calculation, or dynastic arrangement, or ceremony. He paused. Not for effect, she had learned to read the difference, but because he was finding the precise words, which he always did when what he was saying mattered. She is here because 3 years ago, in a library during a storm, she told me I was arrogant, before she knew who I was, and I have not forgotten it for a single day since. Something moved through the hall. Not quite laughter, not quite its opposite. The sound of a room full of people updating their understanding of something they thought they already knew. And she is here because she came back for me, from somewhere no one else could have followed. He was not looking at the court when he said the second part. He was looking at her. Runa looked back. She thought about the silver wolf with the asymmetric eyes, the one she had given both gazes, forward and sideways, the known threat and the approaching one. She had designed him that way because kings needed both directions. She had not known, when she made that choice, that the king was standing behind her in the dark, listening to her explain him. The threads had known. The threads always did. Mira arrived 3 weeks later on a gray morning, riding a horse that clearly belonged to someone else. Borrowed or lent, she didn't explain. With a pack containing only what was necessary and a considerable quantity of thread. She dismounted in the courtyard and looked at the palace with the expression of a woman who left a place for reasons that still held, and is returning for reasons that have only recently come to exist. Runa met her at the gate. They stood for a moment, the weight of Serene's absence between them, the gap of years, the choice made in a Thornholt clearing, with a dying fire and a dying man, and a decision to stay. I'll need a workroom, Mira said. I have 3. 1. She hefted the pack. We start with theory, then practice, then we find whoever else is out there. Sister Wren joined them before the month's end, bringing her particular expertise in the spiritual cartography of bonds and disruptions, and a quantity of historical documents about suppressant use that she had been quietly collecting for longer than anyone had thought to ask. The students came slowly at first, young people from across the kingdom who had been seeing threads their whole lives and been told they were imagining things, who had arrived at the palace gate with letters of introduction and a confusion they had learned to keep private.
Then less slowly.
The Institute grew in the way things grow when they are planted in the right ground, steadily, and with less fanfare than might have been expected, and with more reach than anyone had planned for. The light came through the garden wall in long, late afternoon angles, the kind that made every surface consider itself carefully before offering its color back. Runa was working on a small piece, personal, not for the Institute, not for any palace record. Just a frame she had set up in the garden when the light was good, with thread she had dyed herself from plants from the kitchen garden, which was an indulgence she had decided she was permitted. The cradle beside her held Lyra, who was 7 months old and was currently conducting a thorough investigation of her own right hand, with the focused attention of someone who has discovered something important and intends to understand it completely. Dark hair, eyes that had settled over the past month into silver gray, and already in the quality of their observation, something that Mira had noted with the resigned pride of a woman who had said probably and been right. Named for a constellation, the way her grandmother Saren had been named for a star. The logic of it felt like a thread that had always been there, only now made visible. Calum was at the garden bench with a stack of dispatches that had been waiting 2 days. He worked through them in the methodical quiet that was his particular way, not fast, not slow, completely present with each document until it was finished. She had learned to recognize when he was at the last one by the way he set it down slightly differently than the others. She heard the different sound now. She looked up. He was watching her work. He had that expression, the one she had no word for, the one she had first seen in a candlelit library when he hadn't known she was watching him watch her. The one that was not for courts or councils or any room with more than 2 people in it. "She'll have the sight," he said. "Probably." Runa checked her tension, smoothed a thread with her thumb. "If she does, we teach her. And if she doesn't, then we teach her something else." She looked at Lyra, who had concluded her investigation of the hand and was now looking up at the sky with the same focused interest. "There's no shortage of things worth learning." Calum was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the bench, past his finished documents, past his cup of tea that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and picked up the small square of practice cloth she had left there that morning, and the needle beside it. She looked up. He had the cloth in his lap and the needle in his right hand, and the expression of a man who has made a decision that is entirely reasonable and requires no justification. "What are you doing?" "Learning to sew." He examined the needle with the focused attention he usually reserved for treaty language. "I cannot be the only person in this household who doesn't know how." A sound escaped her. Partly a laugh, partly something that didn't have a word yet, something that lived in the category of feelings she no longer filed away. She dropped her head back to her own work. The garden held them, the afternoon light going gold as it went lower, the cradle and its serious occupant, the finished dispatches, and 2 frames with threads stretched across them, one carrying years of accumulated skill, and one that would, for some time yet, carry only knots and good intentions, and the specific kind of learning that happens when someone decides to begin. In the East Wing, thread was being sorted by a woman who had come home. In the Northern Hall, a new tapestry was under discussion. On the road from the Western provinces, a young woman who had been seeing silver thread since childhood was 3 days from the palace gate, with a letter of introduction in her pack and no clear sense of what she was about to find. The threads went where they needed to go. They always had. Some stories are about grand gestures. This one is about a scrap of linen no larger than a palm, kept in a corner of a work table for 3 years, held down by a river stone, by a man who couldn't explain why he kept it. Runa never asked to be chosen. She asked to do her work well, to survive with dignity, to keep the people she loved safe. She drank the poison she was given because she hadn't yet found the weapons to refuse it. She bent her head when they asked her to, and she kept thinking the whole time, That's not weakness.
That's strategy. That's the kind of strength that doesn't make noise.
And Calum, a king surrounded by politics and performance, held on to one real thing across 3 years of a curse designed to make him forget. Not a throne, not a name.
A laugh that surprised him.
A girl who told him the truth. The lesson isn't that love conquers all. It's quieter than that. What is real persists, even when everything is designed to suppress it. You don't always have to fight loudly. Sometimes you just have to keep the thread warm until you understand enough to move. And hey, if you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments. No spoiler warnings needed here. We're all in it together. Your reactions are literally what tells me which stories to tell next. So don't be a ghost. Like if this wrecked you even a little. Subscribe if you want more stories where the quiet ones win. And thank you, actually, genuinely, for watching.